I always thought if I lost my job, I'd take a week to feel bad about it and then get back out there. That was the plan anyway. The sort of thing you say when you're employed and can't imagine not being employed. But when it actually happened, when they called me into the conference room on a Tuesday in January and told me the contract had fallen through and they were letting 6 of us go, nothing personal, just the numbers. I didn't feel bad for a week. I felt nothing for about 3 days, and then I felt bad in a way that didn't stop. Doris gave me 3 weeks after that. 3 weeks of me sitting in the apartment applying for jobs I wasn't sure I wanted, making dinners neither of us ate much of, and not talking about what was actually wrong, which wasn't the job. We both knew that. The job just made it harder to pretend we were fine. She said it on a Thursday night, standing in the kitchen with her arms crossed, not angry, just clear. "I think we've known for a while," she said. And I said, "Yeah." She told me I could take the rest of the week to get my things together, and I did. I packed my clothes and my books and the camping gear I hadn't used in 2 years, and I called a friend in Bellingham who said I could use his spare room for a bit. Doris didn't ask where I was going. I didn't tell her. That was the middle of February. I'd been in Bellingham for 2 weeks when I called my father. I don't know what I expected him to say. We hadn't talked much in the last 6 years. Christmas calls mostly, and those were short. But I called him on a Monday night and told him I'd lost my job and my apartment and didn't have anywhere to be for a while, and he said, "Come Thursday, I'll have the cat ready." That was it. No questions about Doris. No questions about what I'd do after. Just that one sentence, and then he gave me the address of the Forest Service maintenance yard off State Route 20 near Mazama and told me to be there Thursday morning. I drove out Wednesday. The route took me east through the North Cascades on State Route 20, the kind of drive that's beautiful in the summer and cold and gray in late February. The road wound through valleys and climbed up into the mountains, and the farther I got from Bellingham, the quieter it became. No traffic, just me and the road and the trees. I had a duffel bag in the back seat with clothes and a sleeping bag, a box of groceries on the passenger floor, bread, peanut butter, cans of soup, the kind of stuff my mother would have packed if she were still alive. I didn't put music on. I just drove. My father worked for the Washington State Department of Transportation's Avalanche Forecasting Division. He'd been doing it for 22 years, the last 7 of them alone at a remote monitoring outpost somewhere in the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest. The station was at 8,000 feet on the eastern flank of the range, accessible only by snowcat from the maintenance yard. The nearest town was Winthrop, 40 minutes down the valley. I didn't know much more than that. He'd told me once, years ago, that the work was mostly data collection, monitoring snowpack, tracking weather patterns, issuing warnings when conditions got bad. He said it was the kind of job where you had to be comfortable being alone for long stretches. I remembered thinking at the time that it sounded like the right job for him. I hadn't spent more than a day with him in 6 years. The maintenance yard was 15 miles past Mazama, down a turnoff that wasn't marked except for a Forest Service sign that said, "Authorized vehicles only." I pulled in as the last light was going flat. The lot was empty. Just packed snow and a maintenance shed with the door locked and a single light on inside. No other vehicles. The tree line rose dark and close on all sides. I parked near the shed and turned off the engine. The silence after the engine cut was immediate and total. I sat there for a minute, looking at the dark trees and the snow-covered lot, and I thought about the apartment in Fremont, about Doris standing in the kitchen with her arms crossed, saying, "I think we've known for a while," about the job applications I'd filled out in Bellingham and hadn't followed up on. I didn't think about my father yet. I wasn't ready to think about him. I opened the grocery box and pulled out a sleeve of crackers and a block of cheese. I ate a few crackers and a piece of cheese, not because I was hungry, but because it seemed like the thing to do. Then I reclined the driver's seat and pulled my coat over myself like a blanket. The cold settled in fast. I could feel it creeping through the car, through the coat, into my chest. I closed my eyes and tried not to think about tomorrow, about the snowcat ride, about seeing my father for the first time in years, about spending a week at 8,000 feet with a man I didn't know how to talk to anymore. I didn't sleep well, but eventually I slept. I woke stiff and cold with gray light coming up over the maintenance yard. My breath fogged the windshield. I sat up slowly, feeling the ache in my lower back from the angle I'd been sleeping at, and rubbed my hands together until the circulation came back. Outside, the snow on the ground was blue in the early light, and the mountains to the west were still dark. I got out and stretched, leaning against the car door. My legs were sore. The air was sharp and still. I ate the last of the crackers I'd brought and drank some water from the bottle I'd left on the passenger seat. It was cold enough that the bottle had a film of ice on the inside. Around 7, I heard the snowcat before I saw it. A low diesel groan from the upper road, then the sound of treads on packed snow. A minute later, the battered Prinoth came around the bend, cracked rear panel repaired with a sheet of aluminum and 4 bolts, treads throwing chunks of snow to either side. It rolled down the access road and stopped on the flat near the maintenance shed. Dad climbed down from the cab. He was 61, lean, with a white beard I'd never seen on him before. It was fully grown out, thick and trimmed close. He was wearing a heavy insulated coat, and his boots were already caked with snow halfway up the shin. He walked over to me and extended his hand. A firm 2-pump handshake, the kind a man gives a colleague he respects. I shook it. It felt strange immediately. My father was not an unfriendly person, but he was not a handshaking person. I couldn't remember the last time he'd shaken my hand. Maybe at my college graduation. Maybe never. I attributed it to the 6 years of distance between us and said nothing. "Good drive?" he asked. "Long." He nodded. "Throw your bag in the back. We've got 4 hours." I got my duffel from the trunk and walked it over to the snowcat. The back had a cargo area with straps and hooks and a few plastic bins lashed down with bungee cords. I set the duffel beside one of the bins and climbed up into the passenger seat. The cab smelled like diesel and old canvas and something else. Something like wood smoke. Dad got in on the driver's side and started the engine. It took 2 tries and then caught, settling into a low rumble. He put it in gear and we rolled forward onto the access road. The snowcat ride was slow and loud. The engine was a constant grinding roar, and the treads made a rhythmic thump, thump, thump on the packed snow. Dad drove with both hands on the controls, his eyes on the trail. The road climbed steadily, winding up through old-growth timber, and then breaking out into open snowfields, where the wind had sculpted the surface into hard ripples. We talked in short bursts over the engine noise. My drive up from Bellingham, the weather coming in later in the week, the condition of the road below the snow line. Dad said the highway patrol had been running chains-required advisories since Tuesday. I said I'd come up before the next system hit. He nodded and said that was smart. He didn't ask about Doris. I didn't offer. The cab was warm from the engine. I watched the trees pass on either side. Subalpine fir, mountain hemlock, their branches heavy with snow. Every so often we'd pass a trail marker or a reflector post, but mostly it was just white and trees and sky. The higher we climbed, the lighter the sky became, until it was a pale winter blue with high clouds moving in from the west. After about 2 hours, we stopped to let the engine cool. Dad got out and checked the treads and the fuel line and the rear panel repair. I got out and stretched and walked a few steps into the untracked snow beside the trail. The silence after the engine stopped was enormous. I could hear the wind moving through the trees and nothing else. Dad came back around the front of the snowcat and said we were halfway. He pulled a thermos from inside his coat and unscrewed the cap and poured coffee into it. He handed it to me. I drank and handed it back. He drank and screwed the cap back on and put the thermos away. We got back in and kept going. By mid-morning, we came around the last bend and the station appeared ahead of us, sitting in a narrow basin below the ridgeline. It was a reinforced timber frame hut, maybe 500 square feet, with double-pane windows and storm shutters on the outside. A radio mast rose from the east corner of the roof. A wood stove pipe vented from the south wall, a thin line of smoke trailing up into the still air. An instrument array was visible on the ridge above, connected by a cable running down to the station. The snowcat pad was 20 meters from the door, a flat area of packed snow with tire tracks from previous trips. Dad parked the snowcat and shut off the engine. The silence came back all at once. I climbed out and stood on the packed snow, taking in the place. The basin was narrow and white, ringed by timber on the lower slopes and bare rock higher up. The ridge called Ridgecrest ran above us to the north, its crest sharp against the sky. The air was thin and cold and smelled like pine and snow and wood smoke. "This is it," Dad said. I nodded. "It's quiet." "It is." He walked to the door and opened it and stepped inside. I followed, pulling my duffel from the cargo area on the way. Inside was a main room with a table, 2 chairs, a propane range, and a radio unit on a shelf near the door. The wood stove was in the corner, door open, coals glowing red inside. A heavy curtain partitioned off the sleeping area. A laptop sat on the table, its screen showing a grid of numbers. Instrument data, I assumed. The place was warm and smelled like coffee and bread and the dry heat of the stove. Dad pointed to the curtain. "I cleared the second bunk for you. You can put your bag in there." I walked over and pushed the curtain aside. 2 narrow bunks, one on each side, with wool blankets folded at the foot, a small shelf above each bunk. I set my duffel on the cleared one and came back out. Dad was standing at the table, his hand on a black hardback notebook that was sitting face down near the laptop. He saw me looking at it and picked it up and slid it to the far edge of the table, under the radio unit shelf, without comment. I assumed it was a work document. Instrument readings, maybe. Snowpack data. The kind of technical notes a man keeps when he's responsible for forecasting conditions that affect road closures and backcountry warnings. I didn't press. Dad walked over to me and extended his hand again, the same 2-pump grip, left hand, deliberate. I shook it. I thought, my father is left-handed. He has always been left-handed. This is not strange, but it was strange. The handshake at the yard, and now this one, twice in 4 hours. I filed it away. Dad let go and turned to the propane range. "I'll make us something to eat," he said. "You must be hungry." I said I was. He opened a cabinet and pulled out a can of soup and a loaf of bread wrapped in a towel. I sat down at the table and looked out the window at the white basin and the ridgeline above. The notebook sat under the shelf, face down just at the edge of my vision. I looked away from it and said nothing. Thursday evening, Dad cooked dinner on the wood stove. Canned lentil soup with bread he'd baked in a Dutch oven. The bread was dense and good, a little burnt on the bottom in the way bread gets when you bake it over coals. We ate at the table without saying much at first. The soup was hot and I was hungrier than I'd realized. After a while, he asked how the job search was going, and I told him I'd applied to a few firms in Seattle and one in Tacoma. Nothing back yet. He nodded and said the market was tough right now, a lot of people getting squeezed. I agreed. We didn't go deeper than that. He didn't ask about Doris, and I didn't offer anything. It was easier that way. At one point, he got up to refill his coffee mug. He reached for it with his left hand, picked it up, carried it to the pot on the stove, poured, carried it back, and set it down to his left. I didn't think about it. He was left-handed. He'd always been left-handed. What I did notice, without really meaning to, was his posture when he stood still. His right hip carried more of his weight, so his right shoulder dropped just a little bit lower than the left. I'd seen it my whole life. an old ski injury to his left knee that never healed right. When he stood at the range stirring the soup earlier, his left hand had held the spoon and his right side leaned slightly into the counter, his right hand hanging a little lower than the left. It was just how he stood. I filed it away without thinking about why. Before we went to bed, he banked the wood stove for the night, moving the coals around with the poker and closing the damper part way. While he was doing that, he said, without looking at me, "I've been keeping a detailed log since November. It's not standard practice, but the conditions up here get specific. I'd rather have everything written down than rely on memory." I said that sounded smart. He straightened up, still not looking at me. If something ever happened to me up here, someone would need to be able to read it and understand what I was tracking. I didn't say anything to that. I figured he was talking about succession planning, the kind of practical thinking a person develops when they live alone at 8,000 feet and are responsible for forecasting conditions that close highways and trigger backcountry warnings. It made sense. I went to my bunk and he went behind the curtain to his. The wood stove ticked as the metal cooled. I lay there in the dark for a while before I fell asleep. Friday morning was clear and cold. Dad woke me before sunrise and we had coffee and oatmeal, and then he said he wanted to take me up to the instrument array on the ridge. I put on my boots and coat and followed him out. The walk up took about 20 minutes. The path was packed from repeated trips, but the snow on either side was deep and undisturbed. The instruments were mounted on metal frames bolted into the rock, snow pillows to measure weight, ultrasonic depth sensors pointed down at the snowpack, temperature and wind gauges on a mast. Dad walked me through each one, explaining what it measured and how the data fed down the cable to the laptop in the station. He was a good teacher, patient and specific. He didn't rush through anything. Before we headed back down, he walked over to the snowcat, which was parked on a cleared pad near the ridge marker. He opened the passenger door and said, "Let me show you something." I walked over and watched as he climbed in from the passenger side, stepping up onto the foothold and grabbing the frame with his right hand while his left hand went to the brake lever. "Left hand on the lever, right hand on the frame," he said, settling into the seat. "Always. If you get it backward in a hurry, you'll release the brake before you're seated." He climbed back out and did it again, the same way. Left hand on the lever, right hand on the frame. I watched both times. "Got it?" he asked. I said yes. We walked back down to the station. I assumed it was standard safety instruction, the kind of thing you teach someone who might need to use the snowcat in an emergency. Friday afternoon, he went outside to check the cable connection to the instruments. He said one of the sensors had been giving intermittent readings, and he wanted to make sure it wasn't a loose connection at the junction box. I stayed inside and sat at the table with my paperback, a thriller I'd picked up at a used bookstore in Bellingham and hadn't been able to get into. I noticed the log notebook wasn't under the shelf anymore. It was on the table, face down, about 2 feet away from me. I looked at it for a second and then went back to my book. I didn't open it. It wasn't mine to open. Saturday was overcast. The light coming through the windows was flat and gray, and Dad said a low-pressure system was moving in from the west. He spent the morning on the radio with the forecast office in Wenatchee, relaying instrument readings. I could hear him giving numbers: snowpack depth, wind speed, temperature at ridge level, in the calm, even tone he used for work. When he was done, I went outside and split wood from the covered stack near the east wall of the station. The cold made the wood split clean, and I got through half the stack before my hands started to ache. I stacked it near the door, where it would be easy to bring inside. In the afternoon, we played cards. Gin rummy, but with a variant rule Dad had been playing since I was a kid. If you knocked and got caught with deadwood, your opponent could lay off cards onto your melds before scoring. I'd never seen anyone else play it that way. It was just something he did. He won 3 games out of 4. When he laid his cards down for the final hand, he reached across the table to gather them with his left hand, his right arm resting along the edge of the table with his right hand hanging lower than the left, the way it always did. I shuffled for the next round, but he said he was done and got up to make more coffee. That night, before I went to my bunk, he shook my hand again. The same two-pump grip, his left hand firm and deliberate, the same pressure as the first morning. 3 mornings, 3 handshakes. I thought, this is a thing he does now, up here alone. Some ritual he's developed to mark the days or to remind himself there's still another person in the world. I didn't think further than that. I lay on my bunk in the dark, listening to the wood stove settle, the same handshake still in my palm a 3rd time, still without explanation. I woke at 2 in the morning because the wood stove had died down and the room was cold. The kind of cold that gets into your bones when you're sleeping. The kind that wakes you up even though you don't want to be awake. I lay there for a minute, trying to decide if I could just pull the blanket tighter and go back to sleep, but I knew I couldn't. The stove needed another log or we'd both wake up freezing in a few hours. I got out of the bunk and stood there in my socks on the cold floor, waiting for my eyes to adjust to the darkness. The main room was completely dark, except for the faint glow of embers through the grate in the stove door. I could hear Dad breathing behind the curtain that separated his sleeping area from mine. Slow, steady breathing. He was asleep. I walked over to the wood stove and opened the door carefully, trying not to make noise. The hinges creaked a little anyway. I grabbed a split log from the stack beside the stove and set it on top of the embers, then closed the door and stood there for a second, watching the orange light flicker through the grate as the wood started to catch. That's when I saw the notebook. It was sitting on the table, face down, in the same spot it had been sitting all week, the black hardback notebook. I'd noticed it before, seen Dad move it around, seen him slide it under the radio unit shelf when I was looking at it. I'd assumed it was work stuff. Instrument readings, snowpack data, the kind of technical notes a man keeps when he's responsible for forecasting conditions that affect whether roads stay open or close. I stood there in the dark in my socks and looked at it. Dad was asleep. The room was quiet except for the faint sound of the fire starting to build again in the stove. I walked over to the table and picked up the notebook. It was heavier than I expected, substantial. The kind of notebook you buy when you're planning to write a lot and keep it for a long time. I opened it to the first page. What I expected was columns of numbers, instrument readings, timestamps, weather notations, the kind of thing you'd see in any field logbook. What I found was that, at first, the first few lines of each entry started with data, snowpack depth in centimeters, wind speed, temperature at ridge level. But then, partway through each day's record, the entries shifted into something else. Notes that had nothing to do with avalanche forecasting. Not written in code, but written in the compressed, functional language of a man who's used to writing things down for himself and doesn't waste words. Short sentences, direct observations, no extra explanation. I flipped backward through the notebook, starting from the most recent entry. It was dated the previous Monday, 2 days before I arrived. The entry started with snowpack data and wind readings, just like the others. Then, confirmed again this morning, tracks in snow leading from station to instrument array do not match my gait pattern. Stride length consistent, but foot placement altered. Checked my own boots. Tread pattern identical, but wear on left heel more pronounced than on right. Tracks show opposite. I read that twice. Then I kept reading, going backward through the entries. An entry from the week before. Found wood stove banked when I returned from ridge check. I did not bank it before leaving. Logs arranged in pattern I do not use. Larger split on right side of firebox instead of left. An entry from mid-February. Instrument reading logged in my handwriting at 1400 hours. I was not at the station at 1400 hours. I was on the ridge replacing the anemometer mount. I turned back farther. January, December, November. The early entries were more tentative, Dad noting things that didn't add up. observations he couldn't explain. A coffee mug moved from one side of the table to the other. The radio unit turned off when he was certain he'd left it on. Small things that could be explained away as memory lapses or mistakes, except that he was writing them down, and he was writing them down because he didn't think they were memory lapses or mistakes. By January, the tone of the entries had changed. The entries were direct, clinical. He had named what he was dealing with, though he never used a word like creature or entity. He called it the other one, and he was cataloging its properties with the same methodical precision he applied to snowpack data. I stood there in the dark and read the whole thing. It took me 40 minutes. My feet got cold. My legs started to ache from standing. I didn't sit down. I kept reading. The properties Dad had recorded. The other one could enter the station when Dad was outside. It occupied the station for variable periods, sometimes hours, sometimes less. It replicated Dad's appearance and behavior closely enough that at a distance or in low light it was indistinguishable from him. At close range and in good light, there was one consistent observable difference that Dad had identified in early January and confirmed in every subsequent encounter. The other one is mirror reversed. Everything it does with its right hand, I do with my left. It does not appear to know this. It reaches for objects, opens doors, performs tasks as if it believes it is doing them correctly. But every dominant action is on the wrong side. An entry from mid-December read, "It will always reach with the wrong hand. It does not know it is doing it." I turned the page and kept reading. Dad's instructions for managing it. Do not speak to it directly. Do not let it know you have identified it. If you are inside and it enters, leave. Leave slowly, without alarm. Use the pretense of checking instruments. If it has been inside for more than 4 hours, do not go back in. Walk to the ridge marker and wait. Another entry from late January. Snowcat keys are in the left breast pocket of the emergency coat on the hook by the door. If the coat is gone, keys are in the inside pocket of the orange vest in the supply bin. I flipped to the last entry, the most recent one, dated Thursday, the morning I arrived. Time stamped before the snowcat left for Mazama. Son arrives today. Cannot say this aloud. The log has made clear that naming it in the presence of another person changes something about how it behaves, makes it more attentive. We'll use the visit to show him what to look for. He is a structural engineer. He notices load paths. He will see it if I show him where to look. I closed the notebook and set it face down on the table, exactly where it had been before. Then I stood there in the dark for a long time. I thought about every moment of the last 2 days. I thought about Dad shaking my hand when I arrived. The formal handshake, the 2-pump grip, the way it felt firm and deliberate, like he was making sure I felt it. And then again, the next morning, and the morning after that. Every morning. Always the same grip. Always his left hand. I thought about the snowcat demonstration. Dad showing me how to climb in from the passenger side in deep snow. Left hand on the brake lever, right hand on the frame. Always. He'd said it twice. He'd made me watch him do it twice. I thought about the card game yesterday afternoon. Dad laying his cards down at the end of the hand and reaching across the table to gather them up, reaching with his left hand. I thought about the way he moved around the station, the way he poured coffee, the way he opened doors, the way he reached for things, always with his left hand. Always. And I thought about his posture, the uneven stance, right hip lower, right shoulder dropping almost imperceptibly when he stood still, the old ski injury to his left knee that made him carry more weight on his right side, the way his right hand hung a little lower than his left when he rested his arm on the table. I understood now. I had been taught. Every demonstration, every specific observation Dad had offered since I arrived. Every small detail he'd pointed out or shown me or repeated. It was all a lesson. The what, without the why. Delivered in a way that couldn't be overheard. Delivered in a way that didn't require him to say anything aloud that the log said he shouldn't say. He'd been teaching me how to tell him apart from the thing that looked like him. And he'd done it without ever speaking the warning. I stood there in the dark and felt the cold pressing in from the walls and the floor and the ceiling. My hands were shaking. Not from the cold, from something else. I walked back to my bunk and lay down and pulled the blanket up over me. Behind the curtain, Dad was still breathing slow and steady, still asleep. The notebook was on the table, face down, exactly where I'd left it. I lay there in the dark and didn't sleep. I woke up that morning to find my father already standing at the propane range with his back to the room. The smell of coffee was heavy in the air, and I could hear the low hiss of the flame under the pot. The wood stove was crackling. He'd already stoked it while I was still asleep. I sat up in my bunk and watched him for a moment before swinging my legs out and putting my feet on the cold floor. He didn't turn around right away. He was stirring something in a pan. Eggs, I realized when the smell hit me. And his posture was the same as it had been for the past 3 days. His right hip lower than the left, his right shoulder dropping slightly when he stood still, the right hand hanging a little lower when his arm was at rest. I pulled on my fleece and walked over to the table. Dad turned his head just slightly and said good morning without looking at me directly. I said good morning back and sat down. He finished with the eggs and used his left hand to pick up the pan, carrying it over to the table where he scraped half onto a plate in front of me and half onto his own. Then he went back to the range and poured a second mug of coffee, picking up the pot with his left hand, and brought it over, setting it down to the left of my plate. I picked up the mug and wrapped both hands around it, feeling the warmth seep into my fingers. Dad sat down across from me with his own plate and mug. His right hip settled lower in the chair. His right hand rested on the table edge, slightly lower than the left. I exhaled. We ate breakfast without talking much at first. The eggs were good. He'd added some dried onion and a little pepper. I finished mine and drank my coffee and waited for him to speak, because that was how breakfast had gone every morning since I'd arrived. He would finish eating first, and then he would say something about the day's work, or the weather, or some small task that needed doing. This morning, he talked about the incoming weather system. A significant snowfall event was expected by Tuesday, he said, and it was going to require continuous monitoring. The instruments would need to be checked every few hours once the front moved in, and if the wind picked up the way the forecast predicted, the ridge sensors might start giving bad readings due to icing on the housing. He talked about it the way he talked about everything, calm and specific, listing facts in the order they mattered. I listened and nodded and asked a question about whether the propane supply would last through a multi-day storm. He said yes, we had enough for 2 weeks if we were careful, and the woodpile was stocked. All the while I was watching his hands. Left hand holding the fork, left hand picking up the mug, right hand resting on the table, lower than the left, the slight hitch in his posture when he shifted his weight, favoring the right side because the left knee didn't carry weight the way it used to. Everything was correct. This was my father. After breakfast, he stood up and said he was going up to the instruments to check the cable connection that had been giving intermittent readings. He pulled on his heavy insulated coat, the brown one he'd been wearing all week, not the bright orange emergency coat that hung on the hook by the door, and laced up his boots. He said he'd be back in 20 minutes or so, and then he went out, closing the door behind him with a soft thud. I stood up and carried the plates over to the wash basin. The water in the kettle on the stove was still hot from breakfast, and I poured some into the basin and added a little soap. I scrubbed the plates and the forks and set them in the drying rack, and then I picked up my mug to wash it. I noticed I'd set it down on the right side of my plate. I stared at it for a moment, the mug sitting there in the rack with a few drops of water still clinging to the rim. I set things down on my right because I was right-handed. I'd done it without thinking. It was automatic. I tried to remember which side of his plate Dad had set his mug down on that morning. I couldn't. I'd been watching his hands, the way he picked things up, the way he moved, but I hadn't been watching the placement of objects. I didn't know if he'd set his mug down on the left or the right. I'd been looking at the hand that held it, not the spot where it ended up. I dried my hands on the towel hanging from the hook near the stove and walked over to the window. The morning light was flat and gray, the kind of light that made everything look washed out and two-dimensional. I could see the path heading up toward the ridge, a packed trail through the snow that curved around a stand of subalpine fir and then climbed steeply toward the instrument array. Dad was visible on the path, maybe 100 meters out, moving steadily upward. I watched him. The uneven gait was there, the slight hitch on the left side, the way his right hip carried more of his weight with each step. He moved the way he always moved. I watched until he disappeared above the tree line, and then I turned away from the window and sat back down at the table. I picked up my paperback, the same one I'd been reading for 3 days, and opened it to the page I'd marked with a torn piece of newspaper. I read the first paragraph. Then I read it again. Then I read it a third time and realized I hadn't retained a single word. I stared at the page and listened to the sound of the wood stove crackling and the faint hum of the propane flame under the kettle and the silence beyond the walls. 20 minutes later, the door opened. Dad came back in, stamping snow from his boots on the mat just inside the threshold. He said the connection looked fine, probably a temperature issue causing intermittent resistance in the cable housing. Nothing to worry about, but he'd keep an eye on it. He walked over to the stove and poured himself more coffee. He picked up the mug with his right hand. I watched him carry the mug to the table. I watched him sit down in the chair across from me. He set the mug down to the right of where his plate had been. I looked at the mug. I looked at his right hand on the mug handle. I looked at his posture in the chair. The right hip was not lower. Both sides were even. The right hand was not hanging lower when he rested his arm on the table. It was the same height as the left. I looked at his face. He looked back at me. He had the same eyes, the same beard, the same weathered skin, and the same deep-set lines around his mouth. "Did you get the reading you needed?" I asked. The thing sitting across the table from me said yes in my father's voice, and picked up the mug again with its right hand and drank. I looked at the mug. I looked at the table. I thought about the emergency coat on the hook by the door, and whether it was still there, and where the snowcat keys were. I did not look at the hook. I did not look at the door. I looked at my paperback, and I stared at the page, and the thing across the table drank from its mug with its right hand, and I did not look at the door. I said I was going to get some air and put on my coat and boots at a normal pace. I didn't look at the emergency coat on the hook by the door when I passed it. But as I moved past, I registered with my peripheral vision that it was there, hanging where it had always been. I went outside. The cold hit my face immediately. I walked away from the station on the packed trail heading toward the tree line, my boots crunching on the compressed snow. When the station was behind me and the trail bent around a stand of subalpine fir, I stopped. I tried to think. The entity had been inside since before breakfast. I didn't know when Dad had gone out. I didn't know if he'd gone out before the entity was already inside, or if he'd come back and found it there, or where he'd gone after that. The log's instruction came back to me clearly, the way I'd read it in the dark the night before. If it has been inside for more than 4 hours, do not go back in. Walk to the ridge marker and wait. I didn't know how long it had been inside. I didn't know where my father was. I turned and walked the packed trail back toward the station from the outside, staying wide of the windows. I circled around toward the instrument path. The snow on the path going up was compacted, and I could see tracks clearly. 2 sets, both in Dad's boot size, going up the slope toward the ridge. 1 set coming back down. I stared at those tracks for a long moment. I couldn't know which set had come back down. I widened my circle around the station and walked into the untracked snow to the north of the building. The snowfield here was open and white, the light flat and gray overhead, and I could see clearly across it. 50 meters from the station, there was a shape in the snow that wasn't snow. It was dark against the white, partially drifted over on the windward side. I walked toward it. My father was lying on his back in the snow with his arms at his sides, the way a person lies when they've stopped moving deliberately rather than fallen. He was wearing his heavy coat and his gloves and his hat. His eyes were closed. I dropped to my knees beside him and put my hand on his chest and felt it rise. Dad was alive. He was breathing slowly, his skin cold, but not the cold of exposure death. I put my hand against his face and his eyes opened. He looked at me. He didn't speak immediately. Then he said in a voice that was rough from the cold, "You read it." I said yes. He said, "The coat." I said I knew. I said I was going to get the snowcat. I told him to stay still and stay awake. He closed his eyes and then opened them again. He reached into his own coat pocket with his left hand and held out the snowcat keys. He'd had them on him the whole time. He'd kept them on him. I took the keys. Dad said, "Don't go back in." I said, "I'm not going back in." I closed my fist around the snowcat keys and stood up, my father's eyes open in the snow below me, the station windows dark behind him. I stood up and looked back at the station. The windows were dark from this angle, the storm shutters not yet closed, the radio mast rising against the gray sky. I didn't see movement inside. I didn't look for it. I turned and walked toward the snowcat, staying wide of the station door. The Prinoth sat on its packed snow pad, battered and familiar, the cracked rear panel with its sheet of aluminum catching what little light there was. I climbed in from the passenger side the way Dad had shown me, left hand on the brake lever, right hand on the frame. The metal was cold even through my gloves. I slid into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine turned over once and died. I tried again. It turned over twice and died. On the 3rd attempt it coughed and nearly caught, and on the 4th it roared to life, loud in the stillness. I let it warm. 90 seconds. Dad had told me that on the first day. Cold engines need time or they'll stall halfway down the mountain. I counted it off in my head, watching the temperature gauge climb, my breath fogging in the cab. When the 90 seconds were up, I put the cat in gear and drove it around the north side of the station, following the path Dad's boots had made in the snow. I kept my eyes forward. I did not look at the door as I passed it. Dad was where I'd left him, a dark shape against the white. I stopped the cat and climbed out. "Come on," I said. "We're leaving." He opened his eyes. He didn't say anything, but he nodded. Getting him upright was harder than I expected. His legs were stiff and his grip was weak, and when I pulled him to his feet, he leaned heavily against me, his breath coming slow and shallow. I got his arm over my shoulders and walked him toward the passenger side of the cat, one step at a time. The snow was uneven and my boots slipped once, but I kept us both upright. At the passenger door, I steadied him against the frame and opened it. He reached for the handle with his left hand and pulled himself up, his movements slow and deliberate. I helped him the rest of the way and closed the door behind him. I got back in the driver's seat. I did not look back at the station. I put the cat in gear and started down the mountain. The 4 hours it took to reach the maintenance yard were the longest of my life. The trail down was the same one we'd driven up on Thursday morning, but everything about it felt different now. The switchbacks were tighter than I remembered. The snow was deeper. The light was flat and gray and made it hard to judge distances. I drove slowly, my hands tight on the controls, my eyes on the path ahead. Dad sat beside me, his head tipped back against the seat. His eyes were closed most of the time, but every so often they would open and he would look at me or out the window, and then they would close again. He was breathing. That was the important thing. He was breathing and he was warm, and I was getting him down the mountain. We didn't talk much. There wasn't much to say. Everything that needed to be said had been written in the log, or demonstrated over 6 days of careful instruction, or was sitting unspoken between us now. At around the 2-hour mark, somewhere on the long switchback section above the Methau Valley, Dad opened his eyes and said, "I should have called you sooner." I kept my eyes on the trail. "I'm here now." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I didn't know how to explain it." "I read the log," I said. "I understood." He nodded slightly, his head still tipped back against the seat. The cat rumbled beneath us, the engine noise steady and loud. The snow slid past outside the windows. After a while, he said, "The handshake, every morning, so you'd know what my grip was like." I glanced at him. His eyes were open, looking at the ceiling of the cab. "I know," I said. "I didn't know in the moment, but I know now." He closed his eyes again. I drove. We reached the Forest Service maintenance yard near Mazama as the light was going flat. My car was still there, parked where I'd left it Thursday night, the roof dusted with snow. I pulled the cat up alongside it and shut off the engine. The silence after the engine stopped was total. I sat for a moment, my hands still on the controls, and then I got out and went around to help Dad down. Getting him into my car was easier than getting him into the cat had been. He could stand on his own now, though he moved slowly, and he held onto the door frame while he lowered himself into the passenger seat. I closed the door and got in the driver's side. I started the car and pulled out onto State Route 20, heading south toward Winthrop. The road was clear, and the driving was easy after 4 hours in the cat. I kept the heat on high. Dad sat with his head against the window, his eyes closed. His breathing was steady. At the highway junction at Twisp, I pulled off into the parking lot of a closed gas station and stopped the car. I took out my phone and dialed 911. The dispatcher answered on the second ring. "I need to report a medical situation," I said. "My father's been exposed to extreme cold at a backcountry posting. He needs to be evaluated." She asked for the location. I gave her the maintenance yard near Mazama and told her the snowcat was there. She asked if he was conscious. I said yes. She asked if he was breathing normally. I said yes. She asked if I was taking him to a hospital. I said I was driving him to Wenatchee now. She told me to keep him warm and to call back if his condition changed. I said I would. She asked if there was anything else. I said no. I ended the call and set the phone down. Dad's eyes were open now, looking at me. "They'll want a report," he said. "I know." "You don't have to tell them everything." "I know." He nodded and closed his eyes again. I pulled back onto the highway, the 911 call done, my father breathing in the passenger seat beside me, and drove south toward Wenatchee. Tanner was treated for mild hypothermia at the hospital in Wenatchee. They kept him overnight for observation. The doctors said he didn't have permanent damage, which felt like good news even though I was too numb to really feel relief when they told me. I sat in the waiting room for 6 hours before they moved him to a room. The chairs were plastic and molded to fit nobody in particular, and the fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency that made my temples ache. I drank coffee from the vending machine because it was something to do with my hands, not because I wanted it. It tasted like burnt plastic, and I drank 3 cups anyway. I didn't call anyone. There wasn't anyone to call who would understand what had happened, and I wasn't ready to explain it even if there was. Mostly I sat and thought about the station, about the 2 sets of tracks going up the instrument path in Tanner's boot size, both heading upward, only one coming back down. About the thing that had sat across the table from me that morning and said yes in my father's voice when I asked if he got the reading he needed. about how it had picked up the coffee mug with its right hand and set it down on the right side of the plate, and how I had watched it happen and known in that moment that something was wrong. I thought about how long I had sat there reading my paperback, pretending everything was normal, while that thing drank coffee at my father's table. When they finally moved Tanner to a room, I followed the nurse down the hallway and took the chair beside his bed. He was awake and warm and had color in his face again. His eyes were clear. He looked at me for a long moment and then he said, "You left without going back in." I said yes. He nodded slowly, like that was the answer he'd been hoping for. "Good," he said. We were quiet for a while after that. The room had a window that looked out over the parking lot and the mountains beyond, and I watched the light change as the sun dropped lower. There were things I could have asked. What the entity was, where it came from, what it wanted, whether it was still in the station, sitting at the table, or standing at the propane range, or sleeping in his bunk. But I didn't ask any of those questions. I didn't ask because the log hadn't addressed them. My father had spent 3 months up there observing that thing, writing down everything he saw, and he hadn't answered those questions in his notes, which meant he didn't have answers. And asking now wouldn't change anything about what had happened or what came next. The station would need to be reported to the department. Tanner would need to be reassigned. Someone would go up there eventually and find whatever they found. That wasn't my problem to solve. What I knew, sitting in that chair while my father dozed and woke and dozed again, was this. Tanner Stone had spent 3 months alone at 8,000 feet with something that wore his face and moved through his space and sat at his table. And instead of evacuating or breaking or going silent, he had kept a meticulous log. He had identified the one physical tell that gave it away. And then, when his son showed up with nowhere to be and nothing to hold on to, he had used 6 days of ordinary conversation to pass that knowledge on. Because the log said not to speak it aloud, and so he didn't. He found another way. He taught me to recognize the thing by showing me what the real version looked like. Every demonstration, every specific observation he offered was a lesson. The handshake each morning, the way he moved when he stood at the stove, which hand he used to reach for the coffee pot, how he climbed into the snowcat. He showed me himself over and over, so that when I saw the other thing, I would know the difference. And it had worked. I looked at my father sleeping in the hospital bed, his left hand resting on top of the blanket, and I thought about how he could have called me sooner, could have told me over the phone, or in a letter, or in some other way that didn't involve me driving north and spending 6 days in a remote station with that thing potentially nearby. But he hadn't, because telling me over the phone wouldn't have taught me to see it. And if I ever needed to see it again, I needed to know how. That was the kind of thing my father would think about. How to prepare someone for a situation they might never face, without alarming them enough to keep them from coming in the first place. I stayed in the room with him for 2 days. The nurses brought meals and checked his vitals and asked if I needed anything, and I said no every time. On the second day, Tanner was discharged, and I drove him to a colleague's house on the east side of Wenatchee. The colleague was a man named Ed, who worked in the same division and had a spare room and didn't ask questions. Tanner thanked me and shook my hand, his left hand gripping mine, firm and deliberate, and then he went inside. I got back in my car and drove west toward Bellingham. The roads were clear and the drive took 4 hours. I didn't put on music. I drove in silence and thought about the station, about the snowcat leaving tracks in the snow as I drove it away from the building, about the door I didn't look back at. I thought about my father lying in the snow with his arms at his sides, the keys in his pocket, waiting for me to find him. I thought about the handshake. Every morning my father had shaken my hand, a formal, deliberate handshake, the kind a man gives a colleague he respects. It had seemed strange at the time. My father wasn't a handshaking person. But I hadn't questioned it because there were a lot of things about the visit that felt strange, and I was trying to be respectful and not push. What I understood now, driving west through the mountains with the winter light slanting low across the highway, was that the handshake was the lesson. My father was left-handed. He reached for things with his left hand. He wrote with his left hand. He shook hands with his left hand. And every morning he offered me that grip so I would know what it felt like. So I would recognize it. So that if something else wearing his face offered me a handshake with the wrong hand, I would know. He couldn't say it aloud. The log made that clear. But he could show me. And he did. Every day. A specific, deliberate grip offered without explanation so that his son would know, without being told, what the real thing felt like. I drove for a long time without stopping, and the mountains rose on either side of the highway, and the light was clean and cold. My hands were steady on the wheel. I thought about my father's grip, firm and sure, his left hand in mine. I thought about how it had felt every morning when he shook my hand, and how I would remember that feeling for the rest of my life. The highway stretched out ahead of me, and I kept driving.